switch tracks. Jon Gertner is here tonight. He was just over in the town talking about what his latest book is going to be, Greenland, history going into the issues of climate and melting of the ice and everything. Whew, tough stuff. Tonight, though, here, what we're here for is to have Jon talk about the book that he wrote in 2013, The Idea Factory, Bell Labs and the Great Age of American Innovation. And there was a quote in the introduction that I thought was useful for us here in the bowels of the library. It says, this book is about innovation, about how it happens, why it happens, and who makes it happen. It is likewise about why innovation matters, not just to scientists, engineers, and corporate executives, but to all of us. I'm a history teacher. I came to the makerspace with one of my classes, and I thought, oh, I'm a duck out of water. And I thought, well, no, maybe not. Just start swimming, right? So that quote to me speaks to this makerspace idea, and that it really is for everyone. And I'm seeing all sorts of cross-pollination going on in this room. So it's a really good time, I think, to have Jon come talk to us about this whole nature of innovation, what it means, how important is it, who is it for, who does it. And I'll stop there, because Jon will talk about the book about Bell Labs. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, okay. So to do this, I can sort of just sign in.
We never have a second.
Hardware people.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Thanks. Well, thank you guys. Yeah, that's the book, but I'll give sort of an abbreviated talk. I've talked a lot about Bell Labs over the last couple of years after the book came out. And I often start by saying Bell Labs was the great laboratory of the 20th century, the greatest laboratory of the 20th century. But I think, especially when talking to you guys, sort of that questionable, we live in the 21st century, so why do we care about the 20th century? And this notion of history of technology is, I think, in some ways kind of complicated, because technology is a very forward-looking endeavor, and technologists think about the future and what the future can be or should be or will be, and so why should we go back in time? And that's a very good question, but I think I can, over the next 20, 25 minutes, maybe 30, cut me off if it goes too long, talk about why this place was important and why it's worth thinking about, I think, in many ways. I think first it's probably good to just sort of list what Bell Labs made. There wasn't a Bell Labs store you could go to, like an Apple store. Bell Labs really kind of made the stuff that's inside the stuff we use today. They made kind of fundamental technologies that allowed for this information age to happen. And really, the transistor, probably the greatest invention of the 20th century, came out of Bell Labs. The theory of the laser and all sorts of early lasers came out of Bell Labs. Something called information theory, which governed how digital expression, how digital devices, how digital communications are transmitted, came out of Bell Labs. The first idea for how you create a cellular network came out of Bell Labs. The Unix operating system came out of Bell Labs. The C+ programming language came out of Bell Labs. The idea for telecommunication satellites, and the first telecommunication satellites came out of Bell Labs. The first solar cell came out of Bell Labs, the ancestor of every solar panel in the world today. So, very, very big stuff, huge stuff that solved some very big problems. And I think in the book, and as you can see in the title, I use that word innovation. And the word innovation, I would be the first to admit, gets used a lot and probably gets used too much. And it's sort of, I think, the kind of thing where it's become a bit of a buzzword, and certainly a lot of companies use it almost as a marketing term. This is an innovative idea, we'll slap it on almost anything. But if we go back to Bell Labs, and I'll explain more about what it was back in its day, the word innovation had a kind of specific meaning. And like any good, dutiful reporter, I started thinking about what innovation meant, and I went to the library and sort of looked at the word and tried to understand what it was. And if you go back to the origin of what innovation, the word was first used, it goes back to the 16th century, and it was used in England to describe a new idea in religion or philosophy originally. And it's really actually a pretty new word in how we use it here today. It really wasn't until the late 1950s that we started talking about innovation kind of like we do today with technology, that it was a new thing that could be innovative or an innovation. Now, at Bell Labs, they specifically thought of it as something different, something that was not an idea, not an invention, that it took a lot of different people and parts together to create an innovation, that it was something that often was the result of the coordination between scientists and engineers and manufacturing and sometimes even marketing. And that it was something, as one of the managers at Bell Labs kind of famously said, that does an existing job either better or cheaper, or better and cheaper than something that's already in the system today. So better or cheaper, or better and cheaper. It could be a product, it could be a process, it could be both of those things together. But the kind of telling thing about an innovation was that it would have, in Bell Labs' definition, both impact and scale. So if you had an innovation, it would have impact, it would change the world much the way the transistor changed the world, but it would also scale, that it would go out to a large audience, a large base. In those days, it was this vast subscriber network that used the phone companies' telephones, and that it would, again, have scale as we use it. I'm sure you guys talk about scaling up, or you've heard that term all the time. So again, impact and scale. So they called it innovation, but I realize I'm not getting to that question of how they created these things. And I think if we want to figure out how they did it, I'll tell two stories of innovation. One, how Bell Labs created the transistor, and also how some people there created the silicon solar cell. And then I'll try and take a couple quick lessons out of it that you might think about as you guys are doing your own work here. But I think it's really helpful if we go back in time to try and understand what Bell Labs was. And probably the best thing to do is to go back to the 1870s, to the invention of the telephone. And do you know what the telephone, what was great, what was important about the telephone? What did it do that was such a breakthrough? You're in front, so I get to call on you. You could, that's part of it, right. It took sound waves and transformed them into electrical waves that could be sent instantaneously over long distances. And it created, right, this kind of rich communication that was different than the telegraph, right? The telegraph was the existing technology at the time for communications. And the company that grew out of the telephone, really the great innovation of the late 1800s, was in the United States, AT&T, or American Telephone and Telegraph. And for those who are under 30 in this room, the AT&T of that era was very different than the AT&T of today. It was a completely different company. And I think there are two things worth knowing about AT&T of that era. One is that by around 1920 or so, AT&T was the biggest company in the world. It was the biggest company by revenue and employees and stock value. It was also a monopoly. It was given a status by the United States government in 1914 that it was legally allowed to control almost all of the telephone service in the United States. It was a regulated monopoly. It would be regulated by the federal government. it eventually came to control about 80 to 90% of the phone service in the US. And it did this not through one monolithic organization, but through a couple different kinds of companies that worked within AT&T. AT&T controlled all the long distance service in the United States through a division called AT&T Long Lines. They owned all the long lines, they called them trunk lines, that went from coast to coast. They owned all the manufacturing aspects of the phone company, phone service. It was what we call a vertically integrated company. So every part of the phone system was also owned by AT&T and produced and manufactured by AT&T. Telephones, telephone wires, telephone poles, early computers, even the harness belts that held the telephone line into the phone pole. All those things were created by a division that was called Western Electric, which was the manufacturing part there. The phone company also owned either all or part of what we call local operating companies. And these were things like New York Telephone. What was it here in Massachusetts? Was it Matt? Pacific Bell on the West Coast, Southwestern Bell in Texas, the phone company here in Mass. New England Telephone. Okay, so New England Telephone. And these were the connection with the consumer, whereby you would dial into the local network, and that in turn, if you were making a long distance call, would patch you into the long distance network. So all these things were part of AT&T. What I think is really important for me and for us tonight is that in 1925, the people who ran AT&T decided they were going to consolidate all of their engineers and scientists into one laboratory, one corporate laboratory. And, you know, I mean, we think in terms of maybe like Microsoft, Google, Apple. This was a bit different, but those companies too have corporate labs. And this was a corporate lab in an era where there weren't that many corporate laboratories. General Electric had created one a few years before, but what AT&T was doing when it created Bell Labs was on a bigger scale than kind of had ever been done before. They were putting thousands of engineers together to solve the problems of the phone company and to come up with new technologies. And you have to kind of imagine it. There was no phone service. This was a brand new technology. So there were all sorts of problems of transmission and reception, all sorts of more problems than you could possibly understand. And these engineers at Bell Telephone Laboratories were going to solve these questions. Now, the other thing that was very crucial and important to Bell Labs was that they created within this larger group of engineers that were solving oftentimes shorter-term problems or working out development of new ideas, was they created a research group within it. And these were mostly scientists, although some engineers too, and they were looking for new knowledge. And many of them were actually thinking pretty long-term. What could the future of communications be? What should it be? And when I name that kind of greatest hits list of Bell Labs, transistor, laser, telecommunication satellites, all those things began pretty much within the research group at Bell Labs. So you've heard that term R&D, research and development. At Bell Labs, they really kind of, in many ways, perfected it in that notion that you had a research group that was thinking far, far ahead and coming up with new knowledge that in turn oftentimes would be handed off to the development group that would try and actually make it into a product that could go into society. Now, your Bell Labs, you're this big corporate lab and you're attached to a big company that's a monopoly. You're attached to the biggest company in the world. So you have a lot of advantages. Okay, you have a lot of money to work with because you're getting all this funding. And you also don't have really any competition. So in some ways, you're not rushing to market with a product. You don't have to sort of say, you know, Samsung is going to beat me if I don't get my phone to market next quarter. You don't have that problem. In some ways, you don't have to do anything, maybe, except solve the problems of how you get calls to one another. But Bell Labs didn't take that approach. And there's this kind of question, like, why did they come up with so many things that they did? Because they didn't have to in some ways. They were attached to monopoly. I mean, you could argue that they had to because the federal government wouldn't allow them to monopoly. There's a lot of discussion there. But that notion that they had the money, they had the time, they didn't have the competition. And I think really to understand this place, and I think to understand some maybe larger lesson of like how big things really happen, it helps to understand like who the people were who were there. Because I think we have to look to the leadership in many ways who set the agenda for this place. And this is a guy who's like a main character in my book. He looks actually friendlier here than he does in other pictures. Mervyn Kelly, although he doesn't even look that friendly, does he? Mervyn Kelly. So like a lot of people who worked at Bell Labs, he kind of came out of nowhere. A lot of these people were not, they went to good graduate schools, but a lot of them came out of farms or they were actually pretty poor. Mervyn Kelly worked in a hardware store. His dad, worked in a hardware store as a clerk, and he grew up in this very tiny town that I visited in western Missouri. And he was a real go-getter, and he found he had a love for science, and he decided that as an undergraduate he was going to become a physicist. And this would have been about 1910, in an era where there were really actually only a couple hundred physicists in the entire country. And he went to University of Chicago and got a PhD in physics. And in 1915, he was recruited by the phone company. They would send people around just like they do now to colleges. And he was given an offer, and he came to New York City to work at Western Electric as a physicist in the manufacturing part of the phone company in the research department there. When Bell Labs was created in 1925, Mervyn Kelly joined Bell Labs, and he joined the research department. And by 1925, Mervyn Kelly was making these things, actually. And these are, this is a vacuum tube. This is about the size of an incandescent bulb, but it's different. You can see the kind of complicated architecture inside of it. And Mervyn Kelly was working in Lower Manhattan, and he was managing what was called the tube shop. And there were about 70 people working under him, and they were making these things. And he thought of this as the miracle technology of his day. And he thought of that as such because they allowed for the long-distance phone company to exist, or long-distance phone transmission to exist. Because what they found when they tried to create a long-distance network was that phone signals, are weak and they attenuate. If you try and send them a long distance, they kind of die out after a certain distance. And they came up with a lot of gimmicks and technologies to get them farther and farther along. But really by 1915, the farthest they could get a phone call was from about New York to Denver. Couldn't get one cross country. Then this thing came along, and they sometimes called them repeater tubes. It was, what it would do was it would amplify the phone call. It was an amplifier. And the phone company would put these repeater tubes in what were called repeater stations, about every 100 miles across the United States. So if you were calling from New York to San Francisco, your phone call would go through many, I think probably about 30 or 25 repeater stations as it was in those early days as it was going to the West Coast. You might think of it as like kicking a soccer ball down a field every 10 steps or something like that, that it had to go through these devices. It would boost the signal so it could get there. Now, Mervyn Kelly was really good at making these things and making them better and cheaper. In fact, he was the guy who coined that phrase. But he actually would go home at night to his wife and say, I wish there was something else that would come along that would replace these. He considered them an inherently flawed technology, that they broke all the time, they were hard to make, they used a lot of electricity to function. If you guys, we don't use these anymore unless you have unless you play electric guitar or bass, and they use them in amplifiers or high-powered radio transmission. But generally speaking, you don't really see tubes anymore. But they use tremendous amounts of heat. They have to warm up, and they're kind of big also. And he wondered if there was something else that could come along to replace them. There wasn't anything in the pipeline, as they say. This was it, and they kept making them better and cheaper as time went on. And Mervyn Kelly actually went on to rise up farther in management at Bell Labs. He left the tube shop and became the head of research at Bell Labs, and then he became the vice president. Now, if we that was 1925. If we kind of focus on Mervyn Kelly a little bit later in his life, and we go to maybe 1937. Mervyn Kelly at that point has risen up the ranks. He'll eventually be the president of Bell Labs, but at this point he's the head of research. And if you want to know, I was very curious when I was working on this book and doing the research, what are those moments when the world changes? That sort of moment. If you had a camera at that time, what would happen? And one day in 1937, Mervyn Kelly is walking down the hall at Bell Labs. And Bell Labs is here, it's in New York City at the time. Later they would move to New Jersey. But he's going to visit a friend of his named Clinton Davison. And Clinton Davison is a great physicist at Bell Labs. And the two men are friends. They've been friends for many years. Davison actually would go on to win a Nobel Prize. But for whatever reason that day, Davison isn't in his office. But another guy is. It's this guy that Kelly had hired the year before from MIT. His name is William Shockley. He's young. He's a really brilliant physicist. And for whatever reason that day, Mervyn Kelly sits down and decides to give him a talk. And Shockley will remember this day to the rest of his life. It's the day that Dr. Kelly asked him or told him how good it would be if they could get all of the switches out of the phone system. So I talked about the vacuum tubes, those repeater tubes, and Kelly thought of them as a flawed technology. Well, on this particular day, he was talking about the switches, another crucial part of the phone system, but also another flawed technology. At the time, there were these huge switching stations in every city in the country, and they connected callers, and they had these electromagnetic switches that would click on and off. There were millions of them in the phone system. They were slow because they had moving parts. They broke all the time. They were an enormous expense. Kelly actually also wondered if the predictions for traffic in the phone system came to pass, whether they could actually handle the capacity for the future. So for complicated reasons, if you can come up with a replacement for a vacuum tube amplifier, it has a kind of relationship with switching on and off power. So can you get all the tubes and all the switches out of the phone system? Well, Shockley actually went to work on this problem right away. And Kelly wondered if there was some kind of solid, small device that could do the work of switches or do the work of a new amplifier. And it just so happened that at that point in time, they were using a new kind of materials at Bell Labs. They were semiconducting materials. These were brand new things, so they were using things like silicon and germanium. And Shockley decided that he was going to try and build an amplifier out of solid materials. And he went to work, and Bill Shockley's problem was that he was a really brilliant theorist, but he was a terrible experimentalist. He was a horrible person too, but that comes much later in time. But at that point in time, he did what every innovator does, which was that he failed at building this. And he failed in 1937, and he failed in 1938, and he failed in 1939. He brought other people in to help him build something, an amplifier out of these new materials, and he didn't get anywhere. And the war came along, and everybody at Bell Labs stopped doing this kind of research, and they started working on the war effort. And it really wasn't until the war was winding down. They'd all gone to different places. Some were working for the Air Force and the Navy and the Army. Others were working on tank communications and hand-to-hand communications, walkie-talkie communications. It wasn't until 1945 that Mervyn Kelly decided that he wanted to regroup and create a group back at Bell Labs now that the war was over and look deeper into these semiconducting materials and maybe kind of create some new kind of amplifier or switch. And they all actually moved to New Jersey. They moved to this place. Actually, I grew up pretty close to this, called Murray Hill Labs in New Jersey. And Mervyn Kelly created a group called the Solid State Group. And it's going to sound very obvious to a lot of people in this room, but he was doing something radical. He handpicked a bunch of people, and he had come to the belief during the war that the worst thing you want is like-minded people talking to each other. You wanted a lot of diversity. You wanted physicists and chemists and engineers and circuitry people. You wanted people with different ideas bumping up against each other. And that's what he did. He handpicked a bunch of people. He put Bill Shockley in charge of this. And again, in 1945, this group started working, and they failed. And then they failed in 1946 to get anywhere. But in 1947, two physicists who were working in this group came up with the very first transistor. And if you've ever seen this thing, this is the transistor down here. It's a piece of slightly impure germanium that is about, like I said, about the tip of your penny. And these 2 points were pushing into this piece of germanium. And what the physicists and engineers found was that if you passed a voice signal through this piece, you could amplify a phone call, I think it was 18 times. You could amplify the phone signal 18 times. So they had suddenly this sort of new amplifier, this new solid amplifier, this thing that didn't seem to have any moving parts. It wouldn't wear out. It didn't use a lot of power like those vacuum tubes did. It used something like 1/millionth of a watt compared to like 50 or 100 or 150 watts like those vacuum tubes. And most importantly, they knew, or Mervyn Kelly knew, that this meant something very important in that it meant a new age of miniaturization. Because you can't make an iPhone out of vacuum tubes. It would be the size of Andover's library. And you can, they knew, fit about 100 of these or a couple hundred of these in an outstretched hand. They didn't know that, eventually some guys would figure out how to put a billion, on a chip the size of your thumbnail. But they knew that this harkened in this era of tiny, low-powered devices. So the world changes right away. Actually, it doesn't change at all. They find that these things are really, really hard to make. And it takes a bunch of years, actually, before they can get that impact and scale that I talked about. They had to figure out how to manufacture them. They had to improve those manufacturing production lines. They had to bring down the price of these transistors. And it really wasn't until the early 1950s that they started to make these things in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And even then, it really wasn't until the late 1950s that they kind of made their way into transistor radios and really actually made that impact on culture and society. And I think that's interesting, because if you think about when Mervyn Kelly was working at the Tube Shop, that was 1925. And then he had the idea in 1937 when he talked to Shockley. They made this in 1947, and then maybe it was 1957. So we're almost, almost 30 years after that original idea until we get to that point where it has impact and scale. So a very, very long time, much longer certainly than we see now for rolling out new software. The solar story is related to the transistor. Actually, in the same lab that the transistor was created, these three guys are working on a very different kind of technology. This guy on the right is a chemist. His name is Cal Fuller. And this guy on the left is a physicist named Gerald Pearson. And together, they're working on something called a silicon power rectifier. You don't have to know what that is. We can forget about it, actually. But what was crucial was that Cal Fuller, this chemist, was making pieces of silicon in his lab, and he was putting a very slight impurity on top of them, and he was giving them to Pearson to test. And Pearson was testing these in his lab, and he was doing a variety of tests, but what he noticed was when he shined a very bright light on it, they generated a very large, very sizable electric current. And the photovoltaic effect was known at the time, but what Pearson didn't know was that, what Pearson knew was that no actual material that he knew of or that anyone knew of could generate as much electricity as these little pieces of silicon that Fuller was making. And this struck him. And the other thing that struck him was that he had a friend who was an engineer who was working in a completely different building at Bell Labs, whose name was Daryl Chapin. Daryl Chapin was being asked by his bosses at Bell Labs to come up with power sources for remote repeater stations. So remember I talked about those repeater tubes? They were in repeater stations every 100 miles. Some of them were really remote places, and they used dry cell batteries or diesel generators to work. And he was being asked, are there any other power sources we can use that might take care of this? He was looking at wind power. He was looking at even nuclear energy. Pearson wondered if they could use these pieces of silicon and use the power of the sun. And the three men got together, and they told their bosses, don't bother us, we're working on this project. And within 6 months, actually, or 8 months, actually, they had created something that was called the Bell Solar Cell. And they tested it in Georgia at a remote repeater station in 1955, about a year after they started their work. And it worked actually splendidly. It had other problems that I'll talk about in a second, but this is the sort of ancestor of every solar panel in the world today. It was created almost serendipitously by these three guys at Bell Labs. So, I'll just tease out a couple quick lessons because I know we don't have a ton of time, but what do we learn? I talked to one really interesting guy from former head of research at Bell Labs. He talked about it was a problem-rich environment. So remember, the transistor was a solution to a problem. How do we get the tubes and switches out of the system? And the silicon solar cell was a solution to a smaller problem. How do we get power sources for remote repeater stations? And if you when I talked to a lot of scientists at Bell Labs while I was working on my book and doing research, some would tell me, especially some guys in that department, they would say, this was a place that was filled with the smartest people in the world, and everybody had a lot of ideas. There were tons of ideas. You weren't really looking for ideas, you were looking for good problems. And it's sort of a switch around of what we conventionally think of as good things. If you could find a really good problem, that was a very, very exciting thing at Bell Labs. And I think it was fundamental to how they thought of innovation. They didn't think of it in terms of bright ideas. They thought of it as solutions to very, very complex problems. There's no right way to innovate or invent. And I think something you should please remember, especially you guys as you go off into the world, that if we look just at the transistor, it was certainly a hand-picked group of people that were given free rein over the course of a couple of years from different disciplines to work together. But the solar cell was almost completely the opposite. It was kind of serendipitous, 3 people who got together, they were working on something else entirely, and took a right turn to do this and brought in an engineer who was working on a totally different problem. So the fact that you get smart, interesting people together working on interesting problems, I think, is the crucial connection there. But again, this is an early laser team. This notion that maybe there has to be a lot of people together to innovate. Sometimes some of those early laser teams were 2 people or 3 people. They had a lot of support, and they had that encouragement, and they had the money of Bell Labs to help them, which was important. But again, there's no one right way to do it. We're not good at predicting the future impact or economics of things that change the world. If you look at the debut of the transistor, it was buried in the New York Times on page 46. They said, these guys at Bell Labs have a replacement for the vacuum tube, apparently. And nobody could really, it was actually buried in this column called The News of Radio as like a rundown. And the silicon solar shell was almost the exact opposite. It was seen as a miracle when it was unveiled. It was going to change the world forever right away. And we almost got these exactly backwards, which is not to say that solar power isn't important, but that I think we didn't really understand and couldn't understand the economics of how things happen. In those early days of the transistor, they were kept alive by the military that wanted especially transistors for submarines, for airplanes. They wanted tiny, low-powered devices where space was at a premium. And as Bell Labs kept making them, and as they shared the patents, other companies started making them too, the costs went down. And then when some guys in Texas and California figured out how you could jam a ton of transistors on a chip in an integrated circuit, and then all sorts of other production breakthroughs, the prices went down to a fraction of a penny. Now, the solar cell really only now is kind of getting to the point where it's really challenging all these other fuels, thank goodness. But it's really almost 70 years after that breakthrough, which is not to say that everything must take 70 years, but that different kinds of innovations, I think, can take a longer time, but also that we didn't understand how long it would take for these to become affordable at the time. And I think like the year after it was debuted, one of those guys, Dale Chapin, who invented it, figured out that if he wanted to outfit his house with Bell solar panels, it would cost him something like $1.5 million or something incredible just to run his like refrigerator and his electricity. So now we're at the point where a house, you can outfit it for 10,000, 12,000, even less sometimes. And there's all sorts of other ways to get solar power in your house. But at least at the beginning, we couldn't understand it, couldn't predict it. And I think, as a quick corollary, the other thing they couldn't understand was that the problem you think your innovation is going to solve, and in the case of the transistor, it was that idea of how do we get all the tubes out of the system, how do we find a new amplifier, isn't really the biggest or greatest use of it in the long term. When I was going through the archives at Bell Labs, I came across a letter from a professor at MIT who wrote to the guys at Bell Labs right after the transistor came out, and he said, hey, can you send me some of those? I think they have some use in the computer that I'm building here at MIT. And they sent it to him right away. And at the time, they didn't necessarily see that it was going to be the fundamental element of all computing. But in time, they could. But it's certainly at the beginning, the reason for creating the transistor was not to create better computers. And that was not something that they envisioned. Just a last point. It's always going to come out differently. This is the picture phone. It was how Bell Labs engineers saw the future. If we went back to 1960, it was debuted at the New York World's Fair. It was how we were all going to be talking to each other. And some of the engineers at Bell Labs make the case to me that with Skype and video chats, they were right. And the problem with this is that there was no internet, so there was no bandwidth for this stuff to actually work. And it was really expensive, and Bell Labs and AT&T lost something like $500 million on this. It just was a complete belly flop. And the thing is that you can have a great idea, but being early can also mean being wrong. And in the long run, that yes, they saw the future, but they didn't see the future as it really happened. And no matter how much you try and think you can get the idea right, I think history, or actually the way that progress happens, it's always going to have its result. So some things to think about. If you guys want to ask questions, I'm happy to answer questions, but I don't want to keep you too late either. So. Thanks. Oh, yeah. Oh, Marcel has a question.
I like that phrase, like problem-rich environment.
Yeah.
It seems to me like, wouldn't it be great to have some kind of way of dealing with alternative energy that way? So that's a problem-rich situation. I don't know, it's 2016, I don't think that, because you have like the Bell Labs for alternative energy. But this idea of different skill sets, experts, like really trying to solve a problem, it seems like it's so necessary.
Yeah, I mean, they try, actually, the head of the Department of Energy, Obama's first choice back in, what would that have been, 2008, I guess. So it was Steve Chu, who was a Bell Labs person. And I think in those early days of the Department of Energy, he wanted to kind of create that sort of atmosphere. And they had some success, but some difficulties trying to kind of do that there. It's a good question. I mean, I get that question a lot. Can we have a Bell Labs now? Should we have a Bell Labs? And I sort of, I certainly didn't write the book to have another Bell Labs. I was just doing it as a historian and a journalist because I thought it was important to understand what was done there. But I tend to think that because our era is so different, that I could see it happening again, almost like another Manhattan Project, or there was something at MIT called the RAD Lab, where they did a lot of radar work during World War II. They hired thousands of people. So some kind of urgent, specific problem that needs to be solved, but I sometimes don't think it's going to happen again. It was sort of the right place at the right time for the right technology, and a moment in time where we kind of didn't have that much of a problem with government monopoly, and now it just seems like, at least in the U.S., that environment has totally changed. Free market over everything. Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned they were granted a pretty sweeping monopoly by the government.
Yeah.
Why were they granted such a wide monopoly?
The belief at the time, I mean, there were stages towards granting that, and there were different documents, like the Kingsbury letter. The belief was that, well, there were competing phone companies. Sometimes people had 3 phones on their desk because there was a bit of a mess, and the companies had technologies that were not compatible. And the theory, at least on the part of the government, I think it was probably correct, was that this was an early and important industry, and that it would benefit most by having one single entity having all control, or having kind of a coherent technology connecting calls and servicing people. There were some smaller companies. Like I said, they didn't control all the phone companies and all the phone service, but those smaller companies had to have the kind of compatibility with the larger Bell system. And really, if we go forward to when the phone company was broken up in the early 1980s, the idea was that it was a mature industry and that it should be deregulated. It was not an immature industry that needed government's protection, or that it was going to benefit society anymore by continuing the monopoly, that society at that point would do better by a kind of deregulation. Yeah. So, Michael, yes?
You never told us why Shockley was a terrible person.
Yeah, I mean, Shockley was a racist, and spent really the last part of his life sort of with, abiding deep belief in eugenics, and that society, needed to be protected from the least intelligent members, and that we should have,
Did you also try to explain the key elements of it, and how the other people hadn't really contributed and all that stuff?
Yeah, there's a lot of intrigue. I mean, I go into that a little bit in the book. There's been some, the people who won the Nobel Prize for this transistor were the 2 physicists, Walter Brattain and John Bardeen, and Shockley, who was their boss. And some people have said Shockley didn't deserve it because he didn't work on it. And I actually don't believe that. I don't think they would have he did a lot of the fundamental work, and even though he kind of didn't build the device himself, but he did try and claim more credit, or he wanted sole credit, and then there was a lot of politics going on at Bell Labs at that point in time. But ultimately, the Nobel Prize was given to those three. I mean, I actually think that's stupid because the guys who did the material work on creating the germanium and the silicon later were just as important, but they didn't win a Nobel Prize. So I think prizes in general for science, especially for that kind of science, can be unfair in the sense that they leave people out who made crucial contributions. Yeah, Mike.
You mentioned at some point after, I think, 37, 38, 39, a bunch of failures with the amplifier, they kind of pivoted,
Yeah,
created a diverse team.
yeah,
So who was the kind of architect of that team? And
yeah. That
does
was
your book kind of go into anything about their mindset and why they
yeah.
thought that?
Yeah, it does. It was Mervyn Kelly who did the handpicking of people and created the team in 45. He didn't do it before the war, but he did it after the war. And in part, he did it because at Bell Labs, he was in charge of all their wartime work. And he had watched teams of people from different backgrounds working together during the war, creating technologies faster and better than he thought possible. And he took that lesson in 1945 and said, let's do this with semiconductors and let's try and do it with amplifiers. Yeah.
Is Bell Labs functioning at the same capacity today? And if so, do you know if innovation is going to continue to happen in these like really large-scale laboratories, or will it happen through the smaller startups that are starting to pop up around?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, Bell Labs is kind of a very small, like couple hundred people within. I mean, it gets into a very complicated question: what happened to AT&T? This company split apart and split apart again. And if you can think of a corporate lab that just keeps getting cut up into so many pieces till it stops sort of functioning, it's sort of like that now. It's a small core that has a name of Bell Labs, but really they just kind of work on wireless communication technologies for the most part within Nokia Bell Labs, which now owns part of that. So no, it's nothing like it was. The second question is, yeah, so how should innovation happen, or does it happen? I mean, I think it can happen both ways. I mean, there are corporate labs that still put a lot of money into R&D. Google has high ambitions for its R&D, and they have a lab called Google X, and they have other things that they're doing. It's not at the scale of Bell Labs, but they're working with real cutting-edge technologies and very ambitious ideas. There are large, national laboratories that are funded by, say, like Department of Energy and other places that try and work on new ideas and seek out breakthroughs. But it gets to that kind of tricky question of what is an innovation? Is it like new knowledge? Because sometimes some of these laboratories or some of the universities at Harvard or MIT or whatever you might choose, make breakthroughs in knowledge. They might create a new kind of material that has very important prospects, but it's not yet a product. So then they might spin it out and create a group of people with funding from a venture capitalist to kind of find an application for it. And I think it can happen all different ways. I think that still applies. I think if somebody says, no, it can only happen through small startups, you should probably be skeptical. But if somebody says it can only happen through big organizations, it's worth being skeptical too. So there's room for it. But it does usually, I think the kind of one thing that it takes is, bright people with different ways of looking at a problem and also money, funding. Anybody else? No? All right, sure. Thank you guys. That's a good question.